Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the Read to Know podcast. The very first episode, where the goal is to actually remember what you read. I am here with my good friend, Chris Yarber.
What's up, man?
Hey, how's it going?
I'm excited to do this.
I know, this is going to be kind of fun.
It is.
I've never done a podcast before.
No,
Have
me
you
neither.
ever done them?
No,
All right, well then this is going to be interesting for both of us.
it is.
First off, I just want to talk about a little bit behind why even we started this thing and why we even decided to do this. Partly for our own benefit, but we figured we might as well share this with everyone else because they might find some value in it as well.
Yeah.
So where I got this idea, actually from a Jordan Peterson Instagram post, an Instagram post from Jordan Peterson.
Yes.
So shout out to Jordan Peterson. Thank you for this Instagram post. So this is his advice to someone who wants to become a better learner. He says, read and then put down the book. Then summarize what you have read. Don't look at what you're reading when you summarize. You have to practice recalling, not just repeatedly exposing yourself to the same material. You're practicing remembering. So he goes on a little bit more, but that's the kind of the gist of it. So I was reading that Instagram post. I was looking at that post and I was wondering, okay, like that's good information, but like how do I actually actualize this? How do I make it? How do I turn it into actually something?
Right.
So that's when I was thinking, okay, do I just read a chapter of a book and then I go and talk to myself in the mirror, like through the chapter or whatever? I was like, no, that's kind of weird. I don't want to do that. And then I was thinking, okay, so I need to get someone with me and get someone maybe who reads the same book as me, and we just go through it together, and we kind of one off, each take turns kind of doing that. And I was like, okay, well, if I'm going to go through all that trouble, I might as well record it and then put it out there anyway for anyone else who wants to follow along and listen. So that's what we're doing. And if people want to join in, if they want to read the book as well, then that's great.
Yeah, please do.
They can do that as well. We'll take a chapter at a time of a book, any book that interests us or we feel like we want to read, whatever. Right. We don't have many rules for this. This is not nothing's set in stone. No. We're just kind of going with the flow here.
No.
But we're starting with The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, which is actually, sadly, a book that I have started reading, but I never finished. And that doesn't usually happen. I usually finish books. Yeah. I'm not a person who starts books and then didn't finish them. So right. I don't remember. It was like a year or two ago. So I don't remember exactly why I stopped, but eventually I just stopped reading. So I'm picking it back up. Yeah. And I'm starting from the beginning.
Well, it's a great book. No matter where you're at, no matter where you're at in life, I mean, it's a great book. Whether you're in a position of leadership, just starting off like you are right out of college and starting with your job, or with me working a couple years now into a job, not very much experience. Any place that you are at in life, it's a great book, and the habits that we're going to talk through these podcasts is going to be great for anyone to know, really.
Yep, because you've read this book before in its entirety.
Yes, it was the first book that they recommended to me in a leadership course that I took in college, and I wouldn't be surprised if just about every leadership course in college tells you to read this book first, because a lot of leaders out there will tell you that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yep. All right, so how this is at least going to look for today, we might change it up as we go, but for today, what we're going to do is we're going to just talk about the book, the first chapter, which is in part 1, actually. It's part 1. They're not labeled chapter 1 and chapter 2 in this book, but it's part 1, and it's called Inside Out.
Yep.
That's the chapter that we're looking at today.
Yes.
So we're going to just kind of practice remembering, in a sense, and we're just going to have a conversation about it. It's going to be kind of loose,
right.
But just remembering as much as we can from that chapter, discussing it.
Right.
And then we'll go back and pick up the book and maybe flip through a couple lines or quotes and things that we want to highlight and take a look at.
Right. Yes, and for those listening to this and not watching, we don't have the book in front of us right now. We will pull it up later. Trust us. We're not cheating. We don't have it in front of us. And we're doing this in this podcast. And of course, the purpose, as you stated, is for us to actualize remembering what we read, because you and I both read a lot of books, and there are a lot of people out there who read a lot of books throughout the year, and some of them, like myself and like you, pride ourselves on how many books we read in a year. That's something we actually brag about. I do anyway. And so, but it's not just about, you can read all these books but remember nothing. And so this is a great thing if you're listening to this podcast, and especially as we're in this quarantine time and a time of social distancing as we start this podcast. I think this is a great thing for friends to do with one another, is to say, hey, what book interests you? We both like to read. We have that common interest. That's one reason why we're friends. Why don't we pick up a book together, then put it away and talk about, a couple of pages out of it or a chapter, whatever. So.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's a great thing to do. It kind of also lets you talk about what's in it and just kind of brings it alive a little bit.
Yeah.
A little bit more than just reading it. Oh, I read it. And then, so hopefully that this helps. Hopefully that us doing this not only is benefit to us. We're doing it as a benefit for us. Honestly, it's a little bit selfish in a sense that this is for us.
It is.
But if anyone else finds this valuable or anything too, then they can join in and follow along and
you never know.
Have some fun with it. So anyway, and actually, what's funny is that he mentions something similar to that, and I think it's in the introduction or the preface, not the Inside Out chapter, but he says something to the fact, and I underlined it because it was literally almost a paraphrasing, a different way of saying exactly what Jordan Peterson said. Mm-hmm. He was saying, it's not good to just read and then to move on.
No.
You want to read with the intention of remembering what you read, and then not also remembering, but applying it. Because if it's not applied, then it's not even remembered. It's not even worth remembering if it's not applied.
Right. Right. And I would say for most of the books that I read, and in fact, I've gotten out of the habit of reading, and I've gotten in the habit of listening to books, as we've talked about before. And so I am listening to the 7, habits here, not just, I am reading it, not just listening to it, which reading I think does help with memory and actually looking at it while listening to it. If you don't like to read, but listening to it and looking at it at the same time helps with memory as well. But oftentimes I've noticed if I just listen to a book in a day, maybe it takes 4 hours to listen to, and I listen to that in a day, I'm lucky if I remember one thing from it. So again, another reason why this is important, can be helpful. Yep,
very true. So, all right, I guess let's just get right into it. Inside Out. From what I can remember.
Which may or may not be much. We'll see, and hopefully get better at this as we go.
This is a practice thing.
It is.
Right? So we're not gonna be that great at first, I'm sure. But hopefully over weeks and weeks of doing this that we'll actually be better at remembering the first time we read things and not just the second or third time.
Right.
So the biggest thing that stood out to me in the Inside Out chapter is obviously the paradigm shifts. It kind of seems to me like that first chapter is broken in half a little bit, that the first half is kind of paradigm shifts, and then the second half is character. It's basically character-based.
Yes.
So, and he was talking about principles, which is ideal because you can't change the, you can't have a paradigm shift without knowing the principles that guide those paradigm shifts. Right. But okay, first let's talk about the paradigm shifts, because I think that's an important topic that's discussed before you even get to the habits. We haven't even touched. He hasn't even mentioned any of the habits.
Yeah, this first podcast will not cover any of the habits whatsoever.
Zero habits.
If you're wondering, are we summing up the book in this one episode? No, literally just the first part, Inside Out.
Yep.
And then we'll get to the habits. But
yeah, and which is huge, the paradigm shifts. And I honestly think that it could be overlooked, right, compared to the habits. Like people are just like, let me just get to the habits.
Right.
But the paradigm shifts and understanding that actually gives way to implementing the habits, right? No matter what they are.
Right.
And it was very interesting. The stories that he put in there were also very gripping, like the one talking about how he dealt with his son and his learning and growing in school and in socializing and all that.
Right.
And then also the one where he talks about he was in the subway he was in the subway, and there was a man who was just sitting there reclined in his seat with his eyes closed. And his kids were running crazy, doing crazy things to other people, other strangers in the subway. And he was upset and frustrated. And and he was like, why is this guy just sitting here and not doing anything about his kids? His kids are acting crazy.
Right.
And he taps him on the shoulder and he's like, hey, do you think you could do something about your kids? And he's like, oh, yeah. And he's sorry, I didn't even notice. My wife just passed away and we're on our way home from the hospital. My wife just passed away. And Stephen Covey in a book, he was like, oh my gosh, he's like, I feel like such a terrible person right now.
Right.
Like, because he didn't know. And that's the thing about those paradigm shifts, is that based on the way you look at situations and you look at things can affect the meaning to them.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
And that's anything with, and especially when he's talking about habits, right? So, and even I'm like, how does that, while I'm reading this, I'm trying to think of ways that maybe I've experienced a paradigm shift already, in my life. And I think probably the biggest thing and most recent thing for me is just when I started working out, right? Because let's be honest, I'll be honest with you. I stepped into a gym one time in 20 years of living. In 20 years, I only stepped into a gym one time. Yeah. And of course, I would try to, work out or do some home workouts or do something, and then I would start going to the gym. And I wasn't ever consistent. Mm-hmm. And I'd never even wanted to go to the gym up until, I was 20 or 21, because I didn't feel like I would feel out of place. I didn't feel, like that wasn't where I belonged, or, I just felt out of place there. Right. But it wasn't until I started going and I began to change the way I thought about the gym, right?
Right.
And it was a paradigm shift that happened. It was a slow change, and it wasn't anything I was necessarily 100% conscious about, but it did happen. I started looking at the gym differently, and then it got to the point where I felt like I wasn't out of place at the gym, right? I am someone who works out, and that was an identity that I began to attach myself to,
right? And
even to the point now where the gyms are closed and we can't go to the gym and work out. No. I'm still forcing myself to work out even on days that I don't want to, and it's not because of my willpower, because I don't want to work out, but I think my paradigm regarding working out has shifted to a point where I'm a person who works out, so that's just what I do.
Yes,
it's not a willpower thing for me, even though I don't want to work out sometimes.
Right.
I still do it because that's just now who I am.
Right.
That's how I see the world.
Right. Yeah, I think one thing, and for those of you who are listening to this, and you've used the word paradigms a lot because that's what's covered in this first Inside Out. Right. I love, one thing that makes Stephen such a powerful writer at the same time is because he breaks even that word down into the simplest of terms. Right. And as you mentioned with those stories, connects it to something emotional that draws us deeper into the subject. And so he talks about paradigms, if you may be a little unfamiliar with that term, as he kind of puts it in line with a map. Like the map of Chicago is what what I remember him talking about. And we'll get into the specific paradigms and what the names he gives them and stuff are, because again, we're practicing retaining, and I don't want to get the names wrong, because now as I'm listening to you, the whole time I was thinking to myself, gosh, can I remember and impress you with the names of the paradigms? And so we'll get to that, but that's just part of retaining, practicing that. But he breaks it down to, a paradigm is kind of like a map. It shows you where you are now and where you want to be. And that's exactly what these 7 habits as we go through this book is going to do for us. It's building those 7 habits. It's building these certain things in our life to get us from where we are to where we're going to be. Right. But it takes a shift. It takes, opening up that map, following it, and getting to your destination. And so that's one thing that stuck out to me about the paradigms that I really enjoyed reading.
Yeah.
So then, if I remember correctly, he moves from the paradigms to actually going further into talking about the character elements of it and the principles, right? And that's another interesting thing too, is that those paradigm shifts have to be attached to a principle.
Yes.
Right. And habits are not what make or break you, right? And you trying to form a habit will not work unless that shift happens.
Yes,
but
exactly.
that shift has to happen. That shift that needs to happen has to be attached to a principle.
Yes.
And which is that's a very like broad.
It's very philosophical sounding.
Yes, exactly. But But when you think about it and try and break it down, it really starts to make sense.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Because it's the same thing like I said, I keep going back to the gym thing just because that's something that, kind of resonates with me as of recently and thinking about it. But, you can try and build the habit of going to the gym, but until you make that mental shift, it's more difficult for that to actually, it's hard to make that stick. And that's not just for like gym or eating healthy or whatever, but it's for everything, and especially the habits that he's talking about. But it's for any habit that you want to start doing, and then also any just behavioral change that you want to make in yourself.
Yes.
But,
He, just as you're connecting it to the gym in this Inside Out, he kept making connections to his son, especially early on.
Right.
And one thing that I like about this, dealing with this paradigm shift in these principles, starting off, is at a time in his life he had to realize, okay, I'm trying to make my son just like everyone else, instead of seeing my son for who he is. And that was really the principle that began in him. And then after that principle, and after he started making these shifts, as we're going to talk more in detail here in a little bit, he was able to see change in his son that he was not able to see doing what he was doing before, with trying to make him act a certain way and be a certain way. And so, again, that's the picture that sticks in my mind when we talk about these principles,
right,
because of the personal connection.
Yeah, for sure. And that going, even farther with that, as we continue to talk, actually more and more of what I read in the chapter is coming back to
and that's
me.
the point of talking it out with one another. Grab a friend, talk about it, because it will come, more will come to you. But I'm glad it's coming to you, because not much is coming to me right now.
That's okay. We probably, we'll have our moments.
Yeah,
each
we
of
will.
us. But, jumping onto that personal note, and what he also talked about in those last couple sections of this chapter was of course, the name of the chapter, Inside Out, is why he's calling it an inside out transformation.
Yes.
Is because a lot of times, and myself included, and, I think we all tend to look at a problem or something, some kind of situation that we're in, a problem or whatever, and we like to focus the problem, the solution to the problem is outwardly, is what our normal intuition.
Yes.
Right. But that's not what he's saying. He's saying that the solution basically to every problem that we come into, that we face in life, is actually, the solution is inward.
Yes.
Inside out.
Yes.
That's the whole point of this chapter. And that's really a hard thing. It's an easy thing to say. It's a hard thing to actually live by.
Yes.
Right.
It is.
And of course, I have moments where I do think, I self-reflect, and I'm like, okay, this problem, this is probably because of me. What do I need to do to fix it? Right. And what do I need to change in myself to make this better? But I still have, there are definitely times where I'm like, man, if they would just get their stuff together, or, something like, I'm just making an example, but, there are times where I'm like, man, if that would just fix itself, or this was different out here, and then everything would be fine. My life would be fantastic.
Right.
You know what I mean? But that's not really the solution.
No.
And that's not helping anybody, and it's not helping yourself.
Yeah.
Actually, you know what I mean? And if we focus on, hey, okay, so there's this situation or problem that arises in my life. Looking inwardly, what do I need to do? Whether it's a character change, or do I need to look at this in a different light, right? Or what needs to be done that I can make this situation better myself, personally.
Right.
And, what am I causing? What am I bringing to this situation that might be the reason for the problem, right? That's basically what he's looking at. When he's talking about his son and how he relates to his son, because all these other parents' eyeballs are on them, and how their son's not fitting in, their son's not doing this and that. He comes to the realization that maybe it's how I think about my son and how I look at him that is actually the problem of the situation.
Right.
Not his son, and not the parents, not the other parents.
Right.
But maybe it's how he thinks and looks and feels about his son.
Right.
And that's the kind of, I think that's kind of like the winning attitude to any problem or any situation. But it's, like I said, it's easier said than done.
Yes, it is. Yes. And this is why these habits he specifically calls are for highly effective people.
Right.
Because oftentimes what we see in highly effective people is, or for those that some would count as highly effective, is oftentimes when they look at a situation, they first ask themselves, okay, what can I do different? What can I do better? Instead of just looking at other people and blaming other people for problems that clearly you may, have control over. And so that's why I think he, entitles this book Highly Effective People and starts off with this. And this is one reason why I think as we talk these books out, especially if you grab this book or another book and start talking with a friend, you'll find that this becomes a lot more than just retaining information, but actually turns practical in as we evaluate these paradigms. We're going to ask the question, okay, how can we make these changes in our lives, and how can we make them stick as well, so that it becomes more than just reading a book, but actually doing what comes out of that knowledge that we receive from reading.
For sure. Not just, again, it's great to remember,
right?
But how can we also make this practically applicable to our lives,
right?
Because again, like Stephen Covey says in the introductory chapter or section, is it's not just good to remember, and it's not just good to read. It's not just good to remember, but you have to apply what you've learned. Otherwise, it's not even worth doing.
Right.
So anyway, is there anything else that you remember? Anything else that you want to talk about before we crack open the book here?
There is not. I'm ready to crack open the book because I don't want to say anything wrong.
All right. All right. And then with that being said, let's go ahead and open this book up.
All right.
All right. So we're back now, and we have the books in front of us. I have the physical book because that's kind of my style. Chris, you got the Kindle version.
I'm a Kindle guy, and I like reading it on my computer. I don't actually have any other, not an iPad or any Amazon product to read it off of. But no, I like.
So you sit down. It's computer. All right, sit down. Time to read. Let me open up my laptop.
I do.
That's the way to do it.
And I told you this before we started, but I actually got the infographic edition on Kindle, which. For me, if you're someone who likes to have pictures, I like to have pictures, and it helps me understand a little bit more. Which is going to help with our conversation here in a little bit about these paradigms you kept mentioning.
There we go. So if you want to see the infographics, you're going to have to watch the video.
Yes, you are.
That's basically what we're saying.
Yes, pretty much.
Go to YouTube and find the video.
Yes, go to YouTube, find the video. Right.
All right.
So you talked about these two paradigms, and so I wanted to mention them. And then you're going to go a little bit more in depth. But pretty much what Stephen Covey did was he did a lot of research and found that when it came to success, people from the year 1776 to 1926, all of hundreds of years, that time period, what was focused on was the character ethic, is what he calls it, as the foundation of success.
Right.
And so, again, this book is talking about highly effective people, success, and so the character ethic was what was written. And so the character ethic has to do with integrity, humility, it has to do with temperance, it has to do with justice and patience and modesty and the golden rule, treat others the way you want to be treated. And so that's what was focused on. And then we're going to see the shift after 1926 when we get into the personality ethic. But that's what people wrote on between 1776 and 1926.
What do you need to do to be successful? That's what they said.
Right. Focus on your character.
Right.
Since we're talking about inside out, focus on your character.
Right.
And then you will become more successful just through being pretty much a better person morally.
Yeah.
And
then it has shifted, as what he says here, and he said it's shifted to something that we might call the personality ethic.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, which was written about really post World War I to present day, is we mostly see the personality ethic, which is at first it was seen kind of as, especially right after World War I, like your public image, your attitude and behavior, skills and techniques.
Right.
So a lot of things, instead of inwardly character, personality things that people see, just like they see your personality, they saw those things. Today, the personality ethic is really seen more as like human and public relation techniques. Oftentimes has to do with like a positive mental attitude.
Right.
And so that's really what the personality ethic is describing today.
Yeah. And that's definitely true. Like, it is definitely, there are a lot of things discussing personality ethics out there. Like, you go to the bookstore, there are books on books on books on books on how to speak, how to communicate, how to
get your boss to like you or whatever, and not just books, but like YouTube videos. I mean, there are YouTube videos after YouTube videos after YouTube videos on people talking about how to be charismatic, how to talk to women, how to, how to impress your boss, how to, get ahead in life, or like positive mental, like, how to, think better so you can actualize your dreams, or what have you. There's all that kinds of stuff out there. And what he goes on to talk about through this is that those aren't really bad things.
No.
There's nothing wrong with getting better at talking to people, becoming more charismatic,
right.
Learning how to communicate and understand people better.
Right.
But the problem is when that's the primary goal of how to become successful. That's
right.
like the primary factor in success is, when people think that that's the case, then that's where they can maybe find some issues.
Right. Right.
And, I mean, it's definitely true. I've read books that that talk about like having good mental attitude, or, thinking thinking about what you want to become, or, whatever, those type of things, which aren't bad, but they shouldn't be, based on what Stephen Covey is saying, they shouldn't be the primary thing to focus on, right? He says, I underlined it here, but these things are secondary, not primary traits of success.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Which is really interesting because, I think a lot of people, especially in today's day and age, that's not what they think about when they think about success.
Yes. Yes. There is, and the reason I believe he says that, what you just quoted from him, is because of what, which is on page 31 in my Kindle infographic. In my infographic one, I don't know what page it is for you if you have the physical, but I think what all of that boils down to, and the reason why that may not be the best way, as he mentions, is because he says here that each of us tend to think we see things as they are, that we are objective, but not in this case. We see the world not as it is, but as we are.
Right.
And that's exactly what the problem was with his son, as we were talking about from our retaining memory as we read this inside out, is that we see it as we are, not as the world actually is, because our lens or view of life, is based very much on our circumstances, our nurture, what our experiences, and so that's how we see it. And so, of course, everything that we see and judge in the world is very subjective. Right. It's not as objective as we think it is.
It's limited.
It's limited.
It really is. And that's why he was, annoyed with that, that guy on the subway who wasn't controlling his kids. Right. He was limited in the fact that he didn't know that man's wife had just died. Right. Right. He didn't know that. And if he had, he would have approached the situation completely differently.
He's just thinking to himself, why can you not calm down your kids? Golly, it's not that hard. I mean, I'm a dad. I do it too,
Yep. And poor guy, man.
I know.
It's crazy. And I underlined this as well. I think I underlined this the first time that I read it. Mm-hmm. So the second time I read it just the other day, I tried not to underline as much stuff, only things that I really wanted to maybe mention here. Mm-hmm. But I just tried to kind of soak it in as much as possible when I was reading. But the first time that I went through, I underlined this, and it says, talking more about the success principles versus the good mental attitude and the what is he called? The personality ethic. Yes. He says what we are communicates far more eloquently than anything we say or do. We all know it. There are people we trust absolutely because we know their character. Yes. Whether they're eloquent or not, whether they have human relation skills or not, we trust them and we work successfully with them. Right? And that's true. There are people that we trust and we like and we can trust more than others, even though they might not be the smoothest talker or the coolest person in the room or whatever, but you trust those people because their character is high at a high level and the principles that they live by are good. Right. It's funny, I don't usually write in my books, but I actually wrote underneath this paragraph I was like, but what if you had both? Right? And of course he says that later on. He talks about, the character ethic. That's the primary thing, and that's a great thing to have. Mm-hmm. But you can also have the personality ethic too. You know what I mean? You can have both of those. It doesn't have to be an either or.
No.
But you can work on both. But the character ethic should be the primary focus.
Yes.
For personal growth, personal development, and just overall improvement in life.
Right.
But you can have both.
Right. Yeah, you can. Yeah. You also mentioned principle earlier as well.
Right.
And I thought this was so important as we talk about Inside Out. And I'm glad that he mentions this when it comes to these principles that we work from the inside out. And he says that there's a principle of process, that becoming highly successful, and I love how he mentions this at the beginning of the book, because this is what really draws us in and connects us to one another, is we all, whether we have everything that we've ever wanted, all the money, all the career success, we still don't find happiness in those things, and
right.
he draws a lot of different examples out. So if you get the book and read the first part of it, I mean, that's what he lists for several pages.
Right.
And the inside out is different circumstances where people are not happy, even though they seem to have everything. And so as we work on becoming highly effective, or successful, there is a process to this. And so he says that there are no shortcuts. We know and accept the principle and the process in the area of physical things as well. So what he means by that is, just as we're born, like he goes through here and he says, a child is born, and then a child learns to turn over, and then a child learns to sit up, and then a child learns to crawl, and then walk and run, and all of those different things. There is a process to this. And so this principle and these paradigm shifts that we're talking about, it's certainly not sudden. It's going to be a process. It certainly takes time.
Yeah.
And that's whether little things or in small things, everything that we practice, as he mentions later on in the book, becomes a habit. And so just like you've gotten in the habit of going to the gym and working out and things like that, whether it's good or bad for us, every single thing that we do or in the process of doing is built up to a habit.
Right.
And so it does take time, especially for these good things that we want to do in our life. Concerning this character ethic, it's a process, and so it takes time, which is why we can't get frustrated and give up.
Yep, exactly. He also says here, if we want to make, talking similarly to, the point that you were making, relatively minor changes in our lives, we can perhaps appropriately focus on our attitudes and behaviors. But if we want to make significant quantum change, we need to work on our basic paradigms. Right. And it's the similar, again, the gym is just an easy analogy, but
yes.
It can be applied to anything.
Yes.
And I think we've all done it. We've tried to, I am going to wake up early or what, and you just I'm determined. That's what I'm going to do.
Right.
But doing that might make a little difference. It might make a little difference, but to really affect that and make a big difference long term, it's the mental paradigm shift that needs to happen.
Right.
Which is really interesting because obviously I don't think we think about that very often, right? We want to make a change. We want to do something different. We want to add this into our daily routine, our weekly routine. We want to do something different this year or with our lives or what have you. But we think about the physical, outwardly tasks that we need to do to make that happen, but we don't think about the mental shift that needs to take place in our minds to make that happen.
Right. Through this book, we will find that it's less about doing and more about being.
Yeah.
And that's exactly why he starts off with Inside Out, and the reason why he starts off with this, and why it is important to read. I know for myself, when I'm reading books, I can oftentimes skip maybe some of the stuff at the beginning and get to what we call the meat of the book, but for this, it's super important that you don't do that. And if you're listening to this podcast or watching this and you're like, I'm listening to this and this all sounds good, but I have no idea what they're talking about, go and get the book, read Inside Out, that first part, and you'll understand.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Yeah, and it's definitely interesting as far as when I was reading this. Mm-hmm. I was honestly just asking myself the question, and I'll ask it here, how do we remember to think about the mental mindset shift that needs to happen when we want to make changes in our lives, right?
Right.
I think and part of it is literally what we're doing now is we're talking about it.
Yeah.
And hopefully discussing this and talking about it will help ingrain that into our brains. The next time that I want to make a change. I want to, start implementing this or start doing that, that I can make that mental mindset shift in order to actually make the long-term change, all the long-term implementation of that. And I think that's just the question, like, how, what do we need to do to remember that, honestly,
right.
Right. What do you think?
I think another thing you can do is go back and listen to this podcast again and again and again and again.
I might have to put this on repeat.
You may have to put this
myself.
on repeat to remember, right? Just to listen to yourself and remember. This is going to sound really weird, but oftentimes one thing that I do is I just repeat things to myself, and if I'm alone, I'll actually talk out loud, to try to remember and retain things. And if you're a little bit like me, as I mentioned earlier, with this infographics edition that I accidentally purchased, illustrations always help. And so drawing things out, repeating things, even you did mention discussing, but even writing things out and posting it where I see something every single day is another thing that's great for when it comes to retaining, is actually writing something out and also acknowledging that you're not going to remember everything.
Sure.
It would be great for us to be able to remember everything, but that's just not going to happen. And so what's the most important, which we haven't covered this whole chapter, and we're not going to, but I think, we've been able to pull and plug the most important parts. And so taking out those most important parts, writing them down, repeating them to yourself, having a discussion about it, because more than likely, I would say when you read a book, you would remember I've seen different numbers on this, but you would probably remember about 3% of what you've read.
Right.
You really don't remember a whole lot. I right now, even though I've read the book once and I'm reading it again, I could not list by memory all 7 habits.
Right.
So even I would need to write down every single habit. And so that's just how our brain works, though. So,
Yep.
Yeah.
And it's a practice thing, and just hopefully we try and do what we can to remember what's most important.
Yeah.
But yeah, for sure. So looking at the kind of the last little bit of this chapter here,
Yes.
I'm looking at the headline that says, "The way we see the problem is the problem."
Yes.
And I kind of mentioned this a little bit when we were practicing remembering, right? I mentioned this a little bit, and he says that exact same thing. The way we see the problem is the problem.
Right.
And that, when he goes on, he takes at the very beginning of this chapter, he had examples of, like, maybe you're someone who thinks this way and you're like, oh, I'm in debt and I can't get out of debt,
right?
And I don't know what to do, or like, I have relationship problems, and I don't know what to do, and we've tried every book, we've tried every counseling session, we've tried every, that
and that's what the personality, because he says it right here, that the personality ethic tells me there must be some new book or some seminar where people get all their feelings out. And so that's again where you talk about the character, that's the preference, that's the, if we were to say better, that's why he mentions that, is because the personality ethic is telling ourselves, okay, there must be some kind of book or some kind of seminar here that I can watch, and nothing I'm doing is working. So
it's the internal versus the external.
Yes.
And really the internal is the character ethic, and the external is the personality ethic.
Yes.
And that's how and like I said, that's how, like, I'll look at problems that way often. And I, if I'm not thinking about it, if I don't pay attention to the way I think, I will immediately go to external solutions to the problem.
And since the problem is internal, he mentions this to make it all about external efforts and doing. Really, that's just putting a Band-Aid and covering up what really is the problem. And so things may get better for a little while, or you may be able to do something effectively for a little while, but that's not covering the real issue.
Right, exactly. And he goes through he takes a couple of those same paragraphs at the very beginning, talking about those problems, and he just asks some questions and kind of digs deeper, which is very interesting.
Yes.
About how to maybe pull out what might be some of the answers or solutions to fix the internal problem.
Right.
Which is, again, interesting because it helps put you in that same position. If there's a situation that you're like, what do I do about this? What am I thinking? It just helps turn it and turn it into the internal side of things and help you look at that from an internal point of view.
Right.
It's all about the way you see the problem.
Right. Right.
So,
yes, there's a Albert Einstein quote that he has in here as we get into the close of this chapter, where he talks about, and the subheading for this is a new level of thinking, because that's really what it takes as we evaluate inward instead of outward. And so Albert Einstein said this, that the significant problems we face cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them. And so it takes kind of, we use this word now, headspace. It kind of takes a different headspace. Of course, we can't just look at the problem and think at the same level that we created it.
Right.
We have to go a little bit deeper.
Right. Which makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense. I mean, because you come up with a problem, you need to level up your thinking in order to solve that problem. If your thinking was already high enough to solve it, you wouldn't have the problem to begin with.
Right. And if you're wondering what this whole book about is, it's all about that new level of thinking.
Right.
It's all about thinking. It's not as much about doing these habits. And this is why he starts off with the inside out, as we've mentioned, is that it first starts with ourselves.
Right.
And so that's why he starts off this book, and that's really what the whole book is about as we move forward, because next is an overview of these habits. So he actually does an overview before he gets into each one specifically, and then we'll break one
with
each
the
one
first
apart.
few being inside habits.
Yes.
And then the last few being outside habits.
Right. Which most people picking up the book or reading the title would think, that's what I was surprised by when I first read it, was these first couple are inward.
They're not no one actionable else is, almost. They're, I mean, we'll get into it more, but it's not like wake up at 5 a.m.
Right.
You know what I mean? That's not the internal habit.
No. But in our humanness, if I can say that, we think that, waking up at 5 a.m. and going to the gym and doing these different outward things that we can tell and show other people, that's what's really going to impress them. But we can't get there until we solve what's on the inside first.
Right. Yeah, that's great. And I'll close with this. This is one of my favorite quotes from this chapter, maybe my favorite quote from this chapter, and it sums it up. It sums up the whole inside out ideal and the whole thought process behind it. It says the inside out approach says that private victories precede public victories.
Yep.
That making and keeping promises to ourselves precedes making and keeping promises to others.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's true. And it's just, again, reminding you that the solution to every problem really starts from within.
Yes.
And it's not an external, there are no external solutions to our problems.
Right. And the internal problems that we have and that need to be fixed take a lot more working and a lot more work and intentionality than the outward, but we will only achieve the outward when we get the inward fixed.
Yep. Exactly. Well, I don't think I have anything else left here.
I do not.
Do you?
I do not.
All right.
It's a pretty dense inside-out chapter there. That is a
dense introductory chapter without actually getting into any of the habits at all. That is actually still pretty dense.
It is.
And like I said, I think a lot of people might, I think that's an easy thing to overlook, actually, when reading this book even. You may just mentally just kind of clock out and you're like, when do I get to the habits?
Right.
And then let me read when I start with the habits. But knowing this beforehand lays the groundwork.
Right.
And it really does.
Yeah. And we hope that as we go along, we'll give more retaining and reading tips as we go. But as I mentioned, I think as we get deeper, especially into this book and to others moving in the future, we'll find that this becomes a lot more than just reading. This, when we do read books, it becomes a lot more than just gaining the knowledge, but actually applying it to our lives, which I think this is why we chose to do this book first for this podcast, because it hits the heart of that matter, and that's what we wanted to convey. So, good job, man.
All right. Well, this has been fun.
It has been.
Let's do this again next week.
All right.
All right.
See you
so
then.
the next week we will go over the 7 habits overview chapter, right? So it's part 1, the 7 habits and overview. That's the chapter we'll do next week.
Yes.
And then after that, we will get into the first habit.
We will.
We will get there eventually, but not this week and not next week.
Not next week. No. Go get the book. Read it with us. We hope you enjoy this.
All right. Sounds good.